is John Hendy. I live on Romney Marsh, and I was brought up and raised in the Port of Dover. From a very early age, I had a huge and an all-surpassing interest in the comings and goings of the cross-channel fleets. And when I was aged about 5, a friend of my father's, who was working on one of the cross-channel steamers that ran from Folkestone, invited us to cross at the end of the season from Folkestone all the way to Dover, where the ship was going to lay up at the end of the season. And from that moment onwards, from the age of 5, as I said, I was well and truly hooked. Later on in my school days, I wanted to find out more about the comings and goings of cross-channel fleets. What were the ships? Where did they go to? How old were they? Facts and figures that anyone who's ever been a train spotter will appreciate. And there was nothing there. So at the age of 18, I started writing myself. Now, at the age of 68, 50 years on, I'm still going, still puffing along, and a number of books have been written about the local cross-channel fleets. This one, Folkestone for the Continent, is my latest version, my latest effort. I thought that once Folkestone had closed as a commercial cross-channel port, that it was very important to set out the history of the port and its cross-channel services, because those who had worked the port, of course, were not getting any younger, and I thought that perhaps if I left it too late, some of the wonderful stories and recollections would in fact be lost. And so after that time, and I'm thinking of the 8th of June 2001, when the operator of the roll-on, roll-off service from Folkestone to Boulogne packed up, it was very important to start putting things together. And so it's been a project in the making over these periods. One of the last chapters in my book is in fact written by Captain George Sutcliffe, an old friend of mine, who in the mid-60s joined the BR, British Railways, fleet. And he writes very interestingly and movingly about what it's like as a captain to take a ship in and out of Folkestone, take a ship in and out of Boulogne, across and round the Varn Bank, what you have to look out for, and detailing the captain's rounds, all sorts of interesting detail which I felt was essential to include in this book. The story really starts in 1804, when Lord Radnor proposed building a harbour here in Folkestone. It was a very small, insignificant fishing village at that time, and during the winter months, the fishing boats, which were hauled up on the Stade, the beach there, were often smashed and damaged in the gales. And so Radnor in 1804 proposed building a harbour to protect the ships. And he employed a man called William Jessop. Jessop, the man who was responsible for building the West India docks in London. And he produced 2 sets of plans. One for a harbour which would have 14 acres of water in it. The other, rather more ambitious, for a 30-acre port. Needless to say, they opted for the cheapie. A capital of £22,000 was raised, and the Folkestone harbour rejoiced with the laying of the stone, the foundation stone, on the 30th of April 1808. And Alderman Thomas Baker, the mayor of Folkestone, uttered the immortal words, "May heaven reward the endeavours of spirited men and prosper the Folkestone harbour." And out in the channel, a guns were fired and the band played Rule Britannia, and everyone had a jolly good time. So that was the starting point, and so great plans, great hopes were made for the future of Folkestone as a port. However, there were problems, because along the south coast of England there is the constant moving and shifting of shingle caused by the southwesterly prevailing winds. And by 1818, a scouring basin was required. If you can think of Folkestone Harbour today, there's that bit across the middle, in the inner part, where the railway now runs. Well, before the railway came, they built a wall across there and divided the harbour into two parts, the inner and the outer harbours. At high tide, water would be pent up in the inner part, and then at low tide it would be allowed to rush out, and the idea was that this escaping water would wash and scour out the shingle and the sand that had accumulated in the harbour entrance during the preceding 12 hours. And for a while it worked, but unfortunately by 1842 the harbour company was declared bankrupt. But at that time the South Eastern Railway had arrived here in Folkestone, all the way from London Bridge via Redhill and Tunbridge and Ashford, and it arrived in June 1843. And they ploughed on towards Dover, and that should have been the end of the story, because from its inception the South Eastern Railway wished to operate a cross-channel service from Dover, not from Folkestone. But Dover, being a difficult place, because the Admiralty were involved, Dover decided that they would be awkward, and they imposed very heavy dues upon shipping, and they made life as difficult as possible. And so, the fact that Folkestone Harbour was declared bankrupt in 1842 and was just sitting there silting up, uncared for, neglected, it was decided by the directors of the South Eastern Railway decided in April 1843 to pay £18,000 for the purchase of the harbour. They also decided to spend an extra £250,000 on improving matters. And on the 28th of June 1843, the railway between London Bridge and Folkestone opened. On that day, you could travel the 92 miles from Folkestone to London Bridge in the wonderful time 3 hours 5 minutes at an average speed of 29.6 miles an hour. But it was a transport revolution, because the previous day, before the railway had opened, it would have taken all day to get to London. So suddenly the continent was available, and 4 days before the opening of the railway, the directors of the line had done a jolly and had come down to Folkestone. The Ford Viaduct was then not open, and so they had to get off at a temporary station at Folkestone, somewhere roughly where the central station is today, and they toddled down to the harbour in a stagecoach and crossed the channel, and to the amazement of the people in Boulogne, they handed over copies of that morning's London newspapers. So things to begin with were fairly primitive, and we have a wonderful story. Charles Dickens frequently crossed the channel from Folkestone. He had an ulterior motive because he kept his mistress in Boulogne. So you can understand why he was so keen. And in his short story, Out of Town, he describes a late arrival at Folkestone Station, going over by the South Eastern tidal steamer. A dozen years ago, going over to Paris by South Eastern tidal steamer, you used to be dropped upon the platform of the main line, not a junction, at 11 o'clock on a dark winter's night, In a roaring wind and in the howling wilderness outside the station was a short omnibus which brought you up by the forehead the instant you got in at the door. And nobody cared about you, and you were alone in the world. You bumped over infinite chalk until you were turned out at a strange building which had just left being off being a barn without having quite begun to be a house, where nobody expected your coming or knew what to do with you when you were come, and where you were usually blown about until you happened to be blown against the cold beef and finally into bed. And at 5 in the morning you were blown out of bed, and after a dreary breakfast with crumpled company in the midst of confusion, you were hustled on board a steamboat and lay wretched on deck until you saw France lunging and surging at you with great vehemence over the bowsprit. Happy days indeed. But things did improve, of course. The harbour gradually improved. It was the railway decided it was important to get passengers from the main line down to the station, down to the harbour, and therein lay the Achilles heel of Folkestone Harbour all throughout its operational period, because in order to build a railway they had to have a reverse junction at Folkestone East, Folkestone Junction Station. Trains had to reverse down a 3/4 mile steeply graded piece of railway, and throughout its life this was a problem for the railway operators, and so it was decided that it would be a far better idea to build a low-level approach to the station. And in the 1860s, 1866, a man called Sir Edward Watkin became the chairman of the line. And Edward Watkin was a visionary. He had a dream. Like many other Victorian entrepreneurs, he had a finger in many pies. He was chairman of the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway in the Midlands. He was chairman of the Metropolitan Railway. He was chairman of the South Eastern Railway. He was also chairman of the Boulogne and Amiens Railway in France. And he had a dream of running express trains from the north and the Midland all the way through, using his own railway lines, via Folkestone and Boulogne, all the way to Paris. And then another dream. Why not a Channel Tunnel? And he was a great one for the Channel Tunnel, and it was vital, he thought, in order to extend this railway service to build a tunnel. And they started. In fact, it went about 2,000 yards under the channel, until finally in 1883 it was vetoed by the War Office, who feared that building a Channel Tunnel would allow the French to invade us at some future time. So it was ditched, and the more money was spent on building and improving the harbour. And in 1905, the harbour, as we see it at the present time, was completed. I've had a light shone at me which tells me I've got 2 minutes. Very difficult to tell 200 years of history in 15 minutes. But over the years, of course, the great change was the coming of the car ferry service in 1972, which seemed to be put Folkestone on the map 20 years after Dover had its car ferry service. And the book tells all about this. It tells about the finishing of the car ferry service, because British Railways, of course, the nationalised concern, sold off in 1984 to Sea Containers, and they again sold off to a Swedish company, Stena Line, in 1990. And Stena Line paid far too much for the Sea Link operation, and they decided they needed to retrench, and the first casualty was the Folkestone Boulogne service. So at the end of 1991 it closed. Thereafter sea catamarans and freight services continued, but there the story quickly ends. It went downhill, and in June 2001 the service completely finished. Folkestone Harbour was closed. Roger de Haan took it over shortly afterwards, demolished the link span so that no car ferry service could run anymore, and there today this wonderful creation, this wonderful Victorian creation sits, rather neglected, very sad when one compares with how things used to be. And this book hopefully tells the complete story. It's there for posterity. Thank you for listening.